The Georgia sky was painted in shades of orange and purple as Matthew Carter drove his old blue truck down the dirt road. The engine rumbled softly, pushing through the last few miles toward Willow Creek, the little town where he and his son, Caleb, were hoping to start over. In the back seat, Caleb dozed off, clutching a teddy bear, his head bobbing to the side with every bump. Matthew glanced quickly at the rearview mirror, a tired smile tugging at his lips. After months of uncertainty, they had finally found a shot, even if it was a small one, at rebuilding. That's when he saw her. By the side of the road, a woman was waving her arms, trying to get someone's attention. She looked completely out of place against the dusty backdrop, wearing a crumpled, light-colored dress from the trip, worn-out boots, and carrying a small backpack slung over one shoulder. Her blonde hair was tied up in a messy bun, and her face, though tired, carried a determined look. Matthew slowed down, instinctively cautious. Lone women on deserted roads weren't exactly a common sight around here. He stopped the truck a few yards away, getting out with his hands visible so he wouldn't scare her. "Need some help?" he asked, his voice deep but kind. The woman looked relieved, but she kept her guard up. "Yeah, my car broke down, and my phone's got no signal." Matthew looked past her and saw a silver sedan pulled over with the hood popped open and a thin stream of smoke rising up. He walked over carefully, giving it a quick once-over. "Overheating," he said. "You tried letting the engine cool down?" She nodded. "Yeah, but I've been out here almost an hour and nothing. I started walking, but there's nothing around." Matthew glanced back at Caleb, still fast asleep in the truck. His paternal instincts flared. But he wasn't the type to leave someone stranded either. "Look," he said, scratching his scruffy beard. "There's a little town about 10 minutes from here. I can give you a ride. The repair shop should open up early tomorrow." The woman hesitated, clearly weighing whether she could trust him. Matthew respected that, staying put, giving her space to decide. Finally, she let out a tired sigh. "Thanks. I'll take it. I'm Ellie Dawson." "Matthew Carter," he replied, reaching out his hand. She shook it, a surprisingly firm grip. Matthew opened the passenger door for her and helped toss her backpack into the truck bed. Ellie climbed in, settling into the worn seat with a shy smile toward Caleb. As they drove, silence settled in, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Matthew wasn't much of a talker, and Ellie seemed grateful for that. The road wound through golden fields and wooden fences, the sky now sprinkled with stars. "So, what brings you out to the middle of nowhere?" Matthew asked, more to break the quiet than out of real curiosity. Ellie shrugged, her gaze drifting out the window. "Traveling. Needed some time away from everything." Matthew caught the heaviness tucked inside her words, but didn't push. Everyone carried their own ghosts, and he knew better than anyone that sometimes what you need most is someone who'll just be there. No questions asked. When they finally reached Willow Creek, Matthew pulled up in front of a modest inn. "This place should be good for the night. I can help tow your car in the morning if you want." Ellie smiled, a small but genuine smile. "Thanks, Matthew, really. You have no idea how much this means." Matthew shrugged, a little awkward. Everybody needs a little help sometimes. Ellie looked at him for a beat longer than necessary, like she wanted to say something more, but then just grabbed her backpack and hopped out of the truck. As he watched her walk up to the front desk, Matthew had no idea that the woman he'd just rescued wasn't just some random traveler. Ellie Dawson was actually the owner of a multi-million-dollar real estate empire, and her escape to Willow Creek was about to change both their lives forever. The morning sun was still dragging itself over the horizon when Matthew pulled his truck back onto the dirt road where Ellie had been stranded. Caleb, wearing a blue cap pulled down over his ears, chewed absent-mindedly on a piece of bread while watching his dad hop out with the tow chain in hand. Ellie's sedan was still right where they had left it, abandoned and silent. Matthew crouched down to hook the chain to the front axle. The engine still smelled like burnt metal, confirming she wouldn't have made it much farther on her own. He straightened up, wiping his hands on his jeans, and that's when he heard footsteps behind him. Turning around, he saw Ellie walking down the dirt road, a bottle of water in her hand, and that same tired smile from the day before. "Didn't think you'd actually come back," she said, half joking, half serious. Matthew adjusted his cap on his head. "Told you I'd help, didn't I?" She smiled, a little more relaxed now. Guess I'm just not used to people keeping their promises. Matthew didn't say anything. He just tightened the chain and motioned for her to hop in the truck. Caleb scooted over on the seat, and soon they were back on the road, towing the car toward town. Along the way, Ellie stared quietly out the open window, letting the wind mess up her hair. There was something about her, a sadness buried under layers of determination, that Matthew recognized because he carried the same weight on his shoulders. "You said you were traveling," he said, breaking the silence. "Got a specific place in mind?" Ellie hesitated, like she was weighing how much she should say. Finally, she just shrugged. "Just needed to go somewhere nobody knows me. Somewhere I could breathe." Matthew shot her a brief look. "Willow Creek's good for that. Small, quiet. Folks look out for each other, but they mind their own business too." "That sounds exactly like what I needed," she said, her tone softer. When they got to the town's repair shop, the owner, a gray-haired man named Hank, came out to inspect the car. Matthew explained what he knew, and Hank nodded with a low grunt. "Gonna need some parts. Could take 2, maybe 3 days," he said, scratching his chin. Ellie frowned, clearly worried. "Is there a place in town where I can stay longer?" Hank shrugged. "Daisy's Inn, but it's pretty packed right now because of the Harvest Festival. You can try, but no guarantees." Ellie bit her lower lip, clearly doing the math in her head. Matthew saw the dilemma written all over her face, on impulse, or maybe because he knew exactly what it felt like to be lost. He spoke before thinking it through. "Look, I've got a simple place a little ways out of town. Got a spare room if you don't mind a bit of a mess. Caleb and I don't mind sharing." Ellie blinked, surprised. You're offering me a place to stay?" Matthew shrugged, uncomfortable. "Just till your car's fixed. Doesn't seem right leaving you stuck on the road or paying a fortune at the inn." She studied him for a long moment, the wind tugging at the hem of her dress. Matthew held her gaze steady, letting her see that the offer was genuine, no strings attached. Finally, Ellie smiled, a shy but real smile. "I'll take you up on that. And thank you, Matthew. Really." He just nodded, trying not to think too much about the strange knot forming in his chest. As she gathered her few belongings from the car and helped Caleb climb back into the truck, Matthew couldn't help but wonder what exactly he'd just brought into his life. And Ellie, settling the backpack on her lap, looked out toward the horizon and thought, maybe, just maybe, fate knew exactly what it was doing. The road leading up to Matthew's house wound through golden fields and thick woods. The truck bumped along the rough patches, but inside the cab, the mood was light. Caleb was humming softly, playing with the zipper on Ellie's backpack. Matthew kept his hands steady on the wheel, trying not to glance too much at the woman sitting beside him. There was something about her that didn't quite fit the dust and mud of that road. Even with the wrinkled dress and dirty boots, Ellie carried a quiet kind of grace that made Matthew wonder who she really was. When they pulled up, Ellie held her breath for a second. The house was simple, made of wood, with a wraparound porch and a rocking chair creaking softly in the breeze. There was a small shed out back and a makeshift pen where a few lazy chickens scratched around. "Ain't much," Matthew said, killing the engine and hopping out. "But it's home." Ellie smiled as she jumped down from the truck. "It's perfect." Matthew led her up to the front door, which creaked a little as he pushed it open. The inside was cozy, though clearly lived in. Old furniture, faded curtains, and the comforting smell of aged wood. Caleb ran inside like he owned the place, kicking his boots off at the door before disappearing to explore. "You can have the guest room," Matthew said, pointing to a door at the end of the hallway. "It's got a decent bed, and if you need extra blankets, there's some in the closet." Ellie nodded, still taking everything in. There was a simplicity here, an honesty, that she hadn't felt in a long time. "Thanks again," she said, turning to him. Matthew shrugged, uncomfortable under the weight of her gratitude. "It's nothing. Just stay as long as you need." While she settled in, Matthew headed to the kitchen to whip up something simple for dinner. He was just finishing frying up some eggs and bacon when Ellie showed up in the doorway, her hair down, falling in soft waves over her shoulders. For a second, Matthew forgot what he was doing. "Can I help?" she asked, a playful smile on her lips. "Sure," he said, snapping back to reality. "There's some bread over there if you want to toss it in the toaster." Ellie crossed the small kitchen with light steps. She didn't seem out of place, more like she already belonged there. The unexpected sight stirred something in Matthew more than he cared to admit. While they ate at the little kitchen table, Caleb chattered excitedly about the new school he'd be starting next week. Ellie listened attentively, laughing at his stories and asking questions like she truly cared. Matthew watched silently. It was the first time in a long while he'd seen Caleb so at ease with someone who wasn't him. After dinner, while Caleb headed up to the small attic he used as a bedroom, Matthew and Ellie lingered for a bit at the table, sipping warm tea. "You been living here long?" Ellie asked, fiddling with the handle of her mug. "A few months," Matthew replied. "Before that, Denver. And before that, kinda all over." "Looking for something?" Matthew gave a humorless smile. "Running from some things, maybe. Trying to find others." Ellie lowered her gaze like she understood more than she was letting on. "Sometimes," she said quietly, "no matter where you go, some things just keep following you." Matthew nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle deep inside him. They were two strangers, and yet it felt like they carried the same kind of wounds, scars you couldn't see with the naked eye. The wind nudged the rocking chair out on the porch, its creaking filling the comfortable silence between them. Matthew finished his tea and set the mug down on the table. "If you need anything, my room's the first one down the hall." Ellie smiled, that small, genuine smile Matthew was starting to look forward to seeing. "Good night, Matthew." "Good night, Ellie." As she headed up the stairs, Matthew stayed there for a while, listening to her soft footsteps, wondering why, for the first time in years, the house felt complete. He didn't know it yet, but this mysterious woman full of secrets was about to change his life in ways he couldn't even imagine. Matthew woke up before the sun, like he always did. It was a hard habit to break even now, with no bosses or deadlines looming. The house was silent, except for the soft sound of Caleb breathing upstairs. He pulled on his worn boots, grabbed a jacket, and stepped out onto the porch, where the morning breeze was fresh and smelled of damp earth. He sat in the rocking chair and watched the sky slowly lighten, painting the treetops gold. A little while later, the door creaked softly. Ellie appeared, wrapped in a sweater that was way too big for her delicate frame. She hesitated when she saw him, but when Matthew just smiled, she came closer and sat down on the porch steps. "You always get up this early?" she asked, tugging the sleeves over her hands. Matthew shrugged. "Old habits. Sometimes it's the only time of day when everything feels quiet." Ellie hugged her knees, gazing out at the horizon. "I used to get up early too, but for different reasons." Matthew gave her a curious glance, but didn't push. If she wanted to talk, she would. For a moment she stayed silent, watching the sunrise with an expression full of longing and sadness. "Before I came here," she started slowly, "my life was different." Matthew waited, patient. "I used to work in a world where nobody trusted anyone, where every word, every smile was just part of a negotiation. It was exhausting, and in the end, I realized I'd lost myself." He turned his head to get a better look at her. "You ran away?" Ellie let out a dry laugh. "Something like that." She played with the drawstring on her sweater, clearly struggling to find the right words. She stopped, biting her lip like she was reconsidering. Then she let out a heavy sigh. "I used to be the CEO of a real estate company. Big one. Important. At least that's what they said." Matthew blinked, surprised, but kept his face neutral. "But the bigger I got, the more it felt like I was surrounded by people who only saw numbers. Profits. Ownership." She shrugged, a small, painful gesture. "It got to the point where no matter what I did, I couldn't find any meaning in it anymore." Matthew watched her profile, the raw vulnerability she was trying to hide behind a forced smile. "So you walked away from it all?" he asked, his voice low. She nodded. "Left the company in the hands of someone I trust. Packed a few things and left. No real plan. I just wanted to find a place where things still felt real." Matthew looked ahead, letting her words settle in the air between them. "Did you find it?" he asked finally. Ellie smiled, small and sad. "Still looking." Matthew nodded slowly. Part of him understood that more than he could ever put into words. He had lost things too. Dreams, people, pieces of himself, and he knew how hard it was to start over. "Well," he said, his voice rough with bottled-up emotion, "I think you came to the right place for that." Ellie turned to him, her eyes meeting his, and in that moment, there was a silent exchange, a mutual acceptance that neither of them was exactly who they appeared to be at first glance. The sound of Caleb coming down the stairs broke the moment. They both stood up almost at the same time, like remembering the parts of themselves they were still trying to protect. Matthew smirked. "Bet Caleb's already hungry." Ellie laughed, lighter now. "Me too." They walked back into the house together, the smell of fresh coffee already filling the air. And as the day really began, Matthew couldn't shake the feeling that Ellie's presence in his life, unexpected as it was, might be exactly what he and Caleb needed. Even if he didn't know yet just how much everything was about to change. The morning flew by in a blink. After breakfast, some impromptu pancakes that Caleb devoured like it was a feast, Matthew headed out to the yard to fix the broken fence around the chicken coop. Ellie, to his surprise, insisted on helping. "Not sure I'm any good with tools," she said, tying her hair up in a messy bun as she grabbed a hammer. Matthew smiled, handing her a handful of nails. "You don't have to be. Just hold stuff steady and try not to hurt yourself." She laughed, a light, spontaneous sound that seemed to brighten the space between them. As they worked side by side, Matthew noticed how Ellie didn't complain about the dust, or the hot sun, or the branches scratching at her boots. She just did it. No fuss, no whining. And there was something incredibly attractive about that kind of authenticity. "You're a quick learner," he said after she nailed a board down with just 2 solid hits. "My past life was all meetings and contracts," she replied, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. "But it's never too late to learn something real, right?" Matthew nodded, impressed. Ellie Dawson, the runaway millionaire CEO, was now kneeling in the hard-packed dirt of rural Georgia, smiling like it was the most important thing in the world. And maybe, in that moment, it really was. When they finished, Matthew leaned on the hammer, looking over the patched-up fence. "Not bad at all," he said, shooting her a playful look. Ellie raised her eyebrows, pretending to be offended. "Just not bad? I demand a medal." They laughed, the sound echoing across the open field, mixing with the rustling of the trees. Caleb, who had been playing with a toy truck in the shade, came running over. "I want a medal, too!" he shouted, throwing his arms up. Matthew crouched down and scooped his son up with ease. Caleb let out a deep, happy laugh, wrapping his arms around his dad's neck. Ellie watched the scene with a strange warmth blooming in her chest. There was so much love there, not the loud, showy kind she knew from her past, but a quiet, steady love that showed itself in small, constant gestures. And suddenly, Ellie felt something she hadn't expected. Envy. She had never had that, never had someone waiting for her at the end of the day, someone who cared simply because they cared. Her world had always been built around achievements and results, not roots and real connections. And in that moment she wanted it more than she could admit. "Hey," Matthew called, pulling her from her thoughts. "We always have a picnic on Sundays down by the lake. You should come." Ellie blinked, surprised. He hadn't asked if she wanted to. He'd just included her. The feeling was both unsettling and comforting. "I'd love to," she answered, her voice coming out more genuine than she meant it to. Matthew smiled, satisfied, like he'd already expected that answer. That afternoon, while they packed sandwiches and stuffed old backpacks with blankets and thermoses, Ellie realized something. The life Matthew lived, simple, imperfect, full of genuine little moments, was everything she had always been searching for but never knew how to name. And for the first time in a long, long while, she didn't feel like running. She felt like staying. The lake was just a short walk behind Matthew's house. It was a secluded spot, tucked away between tall trees and rough edges lined with moss-covered rocks. The water was calm, reflecting the pale blue sky like a mirror. Matthew led the way with Caleb running a few steps ahead, hopping over stones and picking up sticks like they were treasures. Ellie followed behind them, carrying a makeshift picnic basket and trying not to trip over the exposed roots. When they arrived, Caleb let out a shout of joy and tossed his cap to the ground before flopping down into the soft grass. Matthew spread out the blanket, setting the basket in the middle. Ellie dropped her backpack and sat down, pulling off her shoes and letting the cool grass brush against her bare feet. "Ain't much," Matthew said, unwrapping a few sandwiches. "But Caleb loves coming out here, so do I." "It's beautiful," Ellie murmured, looking around, amazed by the kind of peace that seemed to wrap around the place like a bubble. They ate slowly, in no rush, laughing at Caleb's stories between bites. Ellie realized it had been a long, long time since she had simply sat and enjoyed a moment without thinking about what came next. After they finished eating, Caleb ran off to play by the water's edge, tossing pebbles and trying to make waves. Ellie watched him with a serene smile, her eyes shining with something Matthew hadn't seen in her until now. Peace. Matthew leaned back on his elbows, letting the sun warm his face. "So," he said casually, "what are you going to do once your car's fixed?" Ellie bit her lip, thoughtful. "I don't know. I didn't really plan that far ahead." "Gonna go back to your old life?" he asked, not completely hiding the curiosity in his voice. She turned her head to look at him, and for a moment, Matthew saw the inner struggle reflected in her eyes. "I don't want to," Ellie admitted quietly, "but I also don't know how to be anything else." Matthew studied her in silence. It was strange to think that someone like her, so capable, so confident, could be so lost. "Maybe," he said, giving a small shrug, "you don't have to be anything else. Maybe you just gotta be you." Ellie smiled, small and sad. "The problem is, I don't even know who that me is." Matthew didn't answer right away. He knew easy answers wouldn't fix years of pain and regret. Instead, he did what he always did for Caleb on the hard nights. He stayed. Sometimes, just being there was the greatest comfort. Caleb came running back, his cheeks flushed and his eyes sparkling. "Dad! Ellie, come see! I found a giant rock!" Ellie laughed, standing up and brushing off the skirt of her dress. "Let's go," Matthew said, offering his hand to help her up. For a second, Ellie hesitated. Then she placed her hand in his. It was a simple gesture, almost automatic. But when their fingers touched, a current ran through Matthew, firm and quiet, like the certainty of something he couldn't quite name yet. Ellie seemed to feel it too, her eyes widening slightly before she looked away, blushing. Matthew held her hand a second longer than necessary before letting go. They followed Caleb down to the edge of the lake, laughing at the boy's discovery, which wasn't exactly a giant rock, but a flat, moss-covered stone. That afternoon, under the golden sun and the soft breeze, Matthew realized he was starting to see Ellie not just as the mysterious woman who had shown up on the side of the road, but as someone who, without even trying, was beginning to become part of his life. And even though he didn't know what the future held, deep down, he knew he was willing to fight for that chance. The sun was already slipping behind the trees by the time they got back home. Caleb fell asleep in the truck before they even pulled into the driveway. Matthew carried the boy in his arms, his small limbs dangling loosely, while Ellie opened the front door for them. She watched as Matthew climbed the stairs slowly, like he was carrying the weight of the world, yet with a tenderness that broke her heart. There was nothing forced about him, no rush, just pure, simple, silent love. When he came back downstairs, he found Ellie standing there, looking out the window at the sky that was starting to fill with stars. "He's a great kid," she said, without turning around. "He's everything to me," Matthew replied, his voice rougher than he intended. Ellie finally turned, crossing her arms like she was trying to shield herself from what she was feeling. "You're a good dad." Matthew let out a low laugh, shaking his head. "I don't know about that. I just do what I can." "That's what makes you a good dad," she answered instantly. The silence between them grew heavy, filled with things neither of them said. Matthew ran a hand across the back of his neck, searching for something, anything, to break the tension. "You want a beer?" "It's nothing fancy, but—" Ellie smiled, easing the air between them. "I'd love one." They sat out on the porch, each with a bottle in hand, the cool night air brushing against their skin. For a while, they just listened to the sounds of the sleeping farm, the distant croak of frogs, the whisper of the trees. It was the kind of peace Ellie didn't know she had missed until she found it. "You ever think about starting over?" Matthew asked, his voice low, staring at the label on his bottle like the answer might be hiding there. Ellie hesitated. "Yeah, plenty of times, but It's harder than it sounds. Matthew nodded. Yeah. You don't have to tell me your past, Ellie. It's none of my business. But if you want to stay here a little longer. He paused, swallowing hard. Well, the offer still stands. Ellie looked at him. Really looked. And for the first time, she didn't just see the man who'd helped her on the road. She saw the man who could be something more, something solid, dependable. And that scared her in a way nothing else in the world could. Thank you, Matthew, she said, her voice barely a whisper. He nodded, accepting it. For a moment, the world felt small and perfect, just the two of them, the scent of damp earth and the stars winking overhead. Ellie wished she could freeze that moment. But old fears, old ghosts, don't disappear so easily. She stood up, pulling the sweater tighter around her. I'm going to get some rest. Good night. Matthew watched as she went inside, the door creaking softly behind her. He knew Ellie carried something heavy, something that made her pull away every time she seemed close to letting her guard down. And yet, he felt it, with a stubborn and growing certainty, that she wanted to stay. Maybe she just needed time. As the wind blew, carrying the scent of damp grass and silent promises, Matthew closed his eyes for a second. He didn't know how, or when, things would change. But he knew that whatever happened, he wasn't going to give up on her. Not this time. The next few days passed in a peaceful rhythm. Ellie started to blend in, almost without realizing it. She helped Matthew with small chores around the house, made breakfast with Caleb, and even clumsily planted flowers in the front yard, laughing at her own awkward attempts. Matthew watched it all from a distance, never pushing her. It was like watching a wounded bird slowly learning to trust again. That morning, Ellie was sitting on the porch, polishing an old rocking chair, when she heard the sound of a car approaching. She frowned. Matthew's place was far enough from town that any unexpected vehicle was cause for attention. Matthew came out of the barn, wiping his hands on a rag, hearing it too. A black pickup truck appeared down the dirt road, way too polished for the dust it was kicking up. Matthew frowned deeper, already on edge. The truck stopped, and a man in a suit got out, adjusting his tie with a look of disdain, like the country air itself offended him. Ellie went pale. Matthew noticed immediately. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low. Ellie stood up slowly, her face hardening into a mask she hadn't worn in days. "Someone from my old world," she murmured. The man approached, his expensive shoes sinking slightly into the soft dirt. "Miss Dawson," he said, his voice syrupy and full of fake politeness. "We finally found you." Matthew stepped forward, instinctively placing himself between Ellie and the stranger. "Who are you?" he growled. The man gave him a look of disdain, like Matthew was nothing but an inconvenient obstacle. "My name is Victor Lane. I represent the board of Dawson Enterprises. We're here to ask Miss Ellie to come back." "I'm not coming back," Ellie said, her voice cold as steel. Victor sighed theatrically. "You can't just disappear. There are contracts, agreements, people counting on you. Your absence is creating problems." Matthew felt Ellie tremble behind him. "She said she's not coming back," Matthew replied, crossing his arms over his chest. Victor ignored him. "You think you can hide out here forever, Ellie? You're responsible for billions in assets, for hundreds of employees. This isn't some childish game." Ellie clenched her fists at her sides. "I never asked for that responsibility. I built the company, and I chose to walk away." "Chose?" Victor laughed dryly. "Abandoned is more accurate." Matthew saw Ellie's shoulders tremble, and something inside him snapped. "Visit's over," he said, his voice sharp as a blade. Victor looked at him, then at Ellie, and his smile soured. "This isn't going away," he warned. "You can run today, Ellie, but tomorrow we'll find you again. We always do." He turned, walking back to the truck. The dust from the tires rose and swallowed the road as he disappeared over the horizon. The silence that settled afterward was thick and heavy. Matthew turned slowly, looking at Ellie. She looked small, shrunken in on herself, her face pale, her eyes lost somewhere far away. "Hey," Matthew said softly, touching her arm. "You're safe here." She looked at him, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "I don't know if I've ever been safe anywhere," she whispered. Matthew wanted to pull her into his arms, to promise her everything would be okay. But he knew empty promises wouldn't help. So instead, he just stayed there, standing by her side, firm and silent. And in that moment, Ellie realized that maybe, just maybe, Matthew Carter was the only person in the world who didn't want anything from her. He just wanted her to be herself. The sun was starting to set, painting the sky with golden and reddish hues, but the tension still hung in the air like a storm ready to break. Ellie sat down on the porch steps, hugging her knees to her chest. Matthew stood there for a moment, watching her silently. The way she tried to shrink herself to disappear from the world made something tighten painfully in his chest. Without saying a word, he sat down beside her, their shoulders almost touching. For long minutes, they just sat there, staring out at the horizon. Finally, Ellie broke the silence, her voice rough from holding back emotions. "You must think I'm a coward." Matthew turned his face toward her, surprised. "Why would I?" "For running away," she whispered. "For leaving everything behind instead of fighting." Matthew shook his head slowly. "Coward's the one who stays trapped in something that's destroying them just because they're scared of what people might think." Ellie bit her lip, fighting back tears. "I gave everything to that company," she said, her voice cracking. "My youth, my dreams, my whole life. And in the end, I became someone I didn't even recognize anymore." Matthew took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "You deserve more than a life that drains you until there's nothing left." Ellie turned her head, meeting his gaze. Her eyes, always so guarded, were now wide open, vulnerable. "You really believe that?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Matthew didn't hesitate. "With everything I am." Something invisible, fragile, and powerful formed between them in that moment. It wasn't just desire or attraction. It was something deeper, something real. Ellie was the first to look away, as if the weight of that connection was too much to bear. I don't know if I can," she said. "Stay. Really leave it all behind." Matthew nodded, accepting the confession without judgment. "You don't have to decide right now," he said, his voice low and steady. "But while you're here, no one's going to force you to be someone you don't want to be." Ellie let out a shaky sigh, like a small part of the tension in her chest had finally found a way out. Night had fully fallen, and the first stars began to blink into the sky. The air turned cooler, and Matthew saw Ellie shiver slightly. Without thinking, he slipped off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders. She held onto the fabric with her fingers, pulling it closer around herself like a shield against the world. "Thank you," she murmured. Matthew just gave her a small smile. "Anything you need, just call," he said, getting up slowly. "Good night, Ellie." She watched him walk inside, the sound of his boots echoing across the wooden floor. When the door closed behind him, Ellie stayed there, alone under the starlit sky, clutching his jacket to her chest. For the first time in years, she felt something she couldn't name. Hope. Not the hollow hope that came with signed contracts or million-dollar bonuses, but a true, solid hope. A hope born from the simple kindness of someone who wanted nothing from her, except her presence. Ellie knew the past wouldn't let her go so easily. But right then, wrapped in the scent of cheap soap and wood smoke from Matthew's jacket, she allowed herself to believe, even if just for a moment, that maybe, just maybe, she could start over. The next morning brought a light mist that hung over the fields, blurring the edges of the world like everything was suspended between yesterday and today. Matthew was already up, tinkering with breakfast in the kitchen, when Ellie came down the stairs. She wore worn-out jeans and one of Matthew's flannel shirts, which practically swallowed her small frame. He smiled when he saw her like that. Natural, almost like she'd always belonged in that house. "Morning," she said, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Morning," Matthew replied, setting another coffee mug on the table. They ate in a comfortable silence, Caleb absent-mindedly chewing while scribbling crooked little drawings on a napkin. "I was thinking about checking out the shed today," Matthew said as he gathered the plates. "There's some broken stuff that might be worth fixing up." Ellie smiled, accepting the silent invitation to spend the day with him. "I'll help." And that's how they spent the morning, digging through old tools, fixing broken boards, laughing when Ellie nearly toppled an entire shelf onto herself. Matthew watched her when she wasn't looking. There was something deeply beautiful about seeing her like this, unguarded, carefree, alive. But behind the lightness, he knew the weight of the world still lingered in her shadows. Around noon, while Ellie was helping sand down an old chair, an unfamiliar car appeared on the road. Matthew and Ellie froze at the same time. This time, it was a sleek black sedan, stopping with a little too much precision right in front of the house. "Another one of them," Ellie murmured, her throat tightening. Matthew stepped out of the shed, Ellie close behind, their steps steady despite the fear pounding under their skin. A woman stepped out of the car, dressed in a gray pantsuit, sunglasses on, a tablet in hand. She was everything Ellie had left behind. Cold, efficient, ruthless. "Miss Dawson," she said, removing her sunglasses to reveal eyes as cold as steel. "I'm here on behalf of the board. My name is Victoria Holt." Matthew stood beside Ellie, silent, solid as a rock. Victoria continued, "We're offering you one final opportunity to return and fulfill your responsibilities. If you refuse, we'll take legal action. Asset freezes, contract nullifications. Your legacy will be destroyed." Ellie felt her stomach churn. It was a threat, a real one. Matthew stepped forward, barely containing the anger flashing in his eyes. "She already said she's not coming back," he growled. Victoria barely glanced at him. "And you are Matthew Carter." Victoria smiled almost condescendingly. "Mr. Carter, this is far bigger than you can possibly understand." Matthew crossed his arms, standing firm. "Maybe, but I understand perfectly well what it means to try to force someone to be something they don't want to be." Ellie swallowed hard, feeling his words echo inside her. Victoria turned back to Ellie, her expression hardening. "You have until tomorrow to reconsider. After that, there's no coming back." Without waiting for a response, she walked back to the car and drove off, the dust rising behind her. Ellie stood frozen, staring at the trail of dust fading into the horizon. Matthew turned to her, his expression softening. "Ellie," he started, but she raised a hand, asking for a moment. "I need to think," she whispered, turning and walking away, heading out into the open field. Matthew stood still, watching her go. He wanted to run after her, to tell her that it didn't matter what the outside world thought, that here with him and Caleb, she was free to be whoever she wanted. But he knew this was a choice Ellie had to make on her own. And deep down, he feared her answer could shatter everything he had silently begun to hope for. The open field stretched endlessly ahead of Ellie, but she barely saw the world around her. Every step on the soft earth felt heavy, like the weight of her decisions was pulling her down. She walked until she reached an old fence, leaning against it to keep from collapsing. The wind tangled her hair, and the smell of earth and hay mixed with the bitter taste of indecision in her mouth. She could feel everything she had built trying to pull her back. The empire, the image, the expectations. It would be so easy to just give in, to do what everyone expected. But then she thought of Caleb, of Matthew, of the simple but true life they shared. A life that, for the first time in years, made her feel like she could breathe without asking permission. The tears came without warning. Ellie buried her face in her hands, allowing herself to cry for the first time since she'd fled the city. She cried for the pressure she carried, for the wrong choices, for the years lost trying to be the woman others wanted her to be. And finally, she cried for the fear of wanting something she might never be able to have. She didn't know how long she stayed there, but when she heard footsteps approaching, she didn't need to look to know who it was. Matthew. He stopped a few feet away, giving her space, like he always did. "Ellie," he called softly. She quickly wiped her face, trying to pull herself together, but Matthew had already seen the pain, seen the fear, and still, he didn't back away. "I don't know what to do," she whispered, her voice broken. Matthew stepped a little closer, his gaze steady and calm. "Yes, you do," he said with quiet conviction. "You're just scared." She let out a humorless laugh, tears still shining in her eyes. "Fear's not enough to build a life." "No," Matthew agreed. "But courage isn't the absence of fear, Ellie. It's doing what you know is right, even while you're shaking." Ellie looked at him, really looked, like she was searching for some hidden lie in his words. But there wasn't any. He was just there, solid, safe. No empty promises, no guarantees, just him, Matthew Carter, the man who had rescued her on the road without asking for anything in return. The man who had welcomed her into his life like it was the most natural thing in the world. The man who now, invisibly, held her hand, saying without words that no matter what happened, he would be there. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice raw. Matthew smiled, small and sincere. "So am I," he said. For a moment, they just stood there, the wind playing between them. Then finally, Ellie let out a long, shaky breath. "I don't want to go back," she said, as if the words themselves were a release. Matthew just nodded. "Then don't." She closed her eyes, allowing herself to feel the relief and the terror that came with that choice. When she opened them, Matthew was still there, still waiting, still believing in her. Ellie took a step forward, then another, until she was close enough to feel the warmth radiating from him. "Staying isn't simple," she murmured. "Nothing worth it ever is," Matthew replied, his voice low. Ellie hesitated for just a second longer. Then, moved by something bigger than reason, she leaned in and rested her forehead against his chest. Matthew slowly raised his arms, wrapping her in a firm embrace, as if to say without words, "You belong here." And in that embrace, Ellie knew. She wasn't alone anymore, and she didn't have to keep running. Matthew's hug was steady, warm, so real that Ellie felt like she could finally stop fighting the world. They stayed like that for a time they couldn't measure. Only when the wind grew colder and the shadows stretched across the field did Matthew speak, his voice low and sure. "Whatever you decide, you don't have to face it alone." Ellie pulled back just enough to look into his eyes. There was no judgment there, no pressure, just unconditional support. She nodded slowly. "I need to figure this out," she murmured. Matthew kept his gaze steady. "Figuring it out doesn't mean going back." Ellie took a deep breath, letting those words sink in. Back at the house, Caleb was already waiting on the porch, tossing pebbles onto the ground, completely unaware of the adult storm that had filled the afternoon. When he saw Ellie, he broke into a big smile and ran to her. Ellie knelt to hug him, feeling his innocence anchor her, a reminder of what truly mattered. After dinner, when the house had fallen quiet and Caleb was sleeping upstairs, Ellie and Matthew sat again on the porch, the rocking chairs creaking gently in time with the night breeze. "I need to face them," Ellie said, staring up at the starry sky. Matthew turned slightly toward her. "You want help?" Ellie smiled, small and tired. "This is a battle I have to fight, but knowing you're here makes all the difference." Matthew nodded, respecting her strength. "I've got some contacts," Ellie went on, her mind slipping back into the strategist mode she thought she had left behind. "Real friends, few but loyal. If I move fast, I can protect my share of the company, make sure they can't use my name or my assets against me." Matthew listened in silence, admiring the transformation happening before him. Ellie wasn't just the lost woman he'd found on the side of the road. She was pure strength, shaped by the battles she had fought. "I can ask them to call up some lawyers I still trust," she said, more to herself than to him. "If I file my formal resignation and have everything documented, they won't be able to drag me back." Matthew gave a small sideways smile. "Sounds like you already know what you need to do." Ellie let out a long breath. "It just hurts more than I thought it would." Matthew leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Leaving behind a part of your life, even one that hurt you, is still leaving something behind." Ellie bit her lip, absorbing the truth in his words. "But maybe," he added, "it's not so much leaving behind as it is making room for something better." She looked at him, and Matthew's smile, that calm, patient smile full of silent promises, warmed something inside her that had been asleep for far too long. Ellie reached out hesitantly, and Matthew didn't hesitate to lace his fingers through hers. "I'll make the calls tomorrow," she said, her decision now firm. Matthew just squeezed her hand back. "I'm with you." And in that moment, Ellie felt that no matter what happened, she wasn't alone anymore. When they finally stood to head inside for the night, something new and precious hung in the air, something no contract, no threat, no past could ever take away from them. The next morning would bring battles, But for the first time, Ellie felt ready. Not because she wasn't afraid, but because finally she had something, and someone, worth fighting for. The sunrise found Ellie already awake. She sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee between her hands, her eyes fixed on the phone screen. Matthew walked in, still tugging at the sleeves of his shirt, and stopped when he saw her. "You okay?" he asked, his voice rough with sleep. Ellie looked up and gave a brief but determined smile. "I'm ready." Matthew nodded, sitting across from her without saying a word, just offering his presence. Solid, silent, unwavering. Ellie took a deep breath and dialed the number she knew by heart, even though she hadn't used it in months. Every ring that sounded in her ear seemed to echo directly in her chest. "Alan Brooks," answered a deep voice on the other end. "Alan," she said firmly, "it's me." The pause on the other end was short, but loaded with meaning. "Ellie," he replied, his voice softening. "We were worried." "I need your help," she said, getting straight to the point. She quickly explained the situation, the threats, the attempt to drag her back, the urgency. Alan listened silently. "You're right to act," he said when she finished. "I still have contacts on the board who respect you. If you formalize your resignation with the right clauses, they won't be able to touch you." Ellie let out a breath of relief. "I need trust now, Alan," she said. "Not bought loyalties." "You've always had my trust," he assured her. Within the hour, Alan would send the documents by email. Ellie would sign everything, and he'd take care of the rest, quickly, quietly, and definitively. When she hung up, Ellie dropped the phone on the table and covered her face with her hands. Matthew reached out, lightly touching her forearm. "Is it over?" She lowered her hands, her eyes filled not with fear, but with something raw and real. "It's ending," she corrected, with a small smile. Matthew stood up and pulled her into a strong hug. "I'm proud of you," he said, his voice muffled against her hair. Ellie clung to him for a moment, letting herself feel the pride in his words, something she hadn't felt from anyone in a long time. "Thank you, Matthew," she whispered. Later, sitting on the porch with the laptop on her knees, Ellie read every line of the documents Alan had sent. Matthew sat nearby, just watching, giving her space. When she finished reading, Ellie typed her name with steady hands and sent the documents back. It was official. She had left Dawson Enterprises behind, not as someone defeated, but as someone who chose her own freedom. Matthew saw the tension in her shoulders vanish, replaced by something lighter, more real. "It's done," she said, closing the laptop with a soft click. Matthew stood up, walking over to her. "Then it's time to celebrate," he said, his smile slowly spreading. Ellie laughed, surprised by the idea. "Celebrate? How?" Matthew held out his hand. "Come with me." Without waiting for an answer, he pulled her out of the chair, leading her across the porch, down the steps, and across the field to the old oak tree where Caleb liked to play. Hanging from one of the low branches was a makeshift swing, a piece of wood tied with rough rope. "Built it with Caleb," Matthew said proudly. "Still needs some work, but it'll do." Ellie laughed. Free, in a way Matthew had never heard before. He gently guided her to sit, and Ellie settled in, looking at him like she was seeing life for the first time. Matthew gave the swing a gentle push, and her laughter echoed across the field. It was simple. It was imperfect. It was perfect, and Matthew knew right then that seeing Ellie happy like that was the most beautiful thing he had ever witnessed. Maybe it was too soon to say it out loud. But deep down, he knew. He was falling in love with her. And maybe, just maybe, she was falling for him too. The sky began to shift, painted in orange and lilac as the sun dipped below the horizon. Ellie stayed on the swing, her hands gripping the rough ropes, feeling the wind tangle her hair. Matthew stood beside her, a constant presence, the kind of presence she had never known she needed until now. When the swing slowed to a stop, Ellie planted her feet on the ground and looked at him, the smile still playing on her lips. "Thank you," she said softly. Matthew just smiled back, as if saying always without needing any words. They walked back to the house in comfortable silence, their hands brushing now and then, as if still getting used to the idea that there was something between them now. Something stronger, more real than any promise either had ever heard before. That night, after Caleb had fallen asleep, Matthew and Ellie found each other again on the porch, where the night breeze carried the scent of fresh earth. Ellie held a cup of tea in her hands, blowing on the steam that rose in lazy spirals. Matthew watched her, admiring the calm that now seemed to wrap around her, but also seeing the fear that still lingered just beneath the surface. "You seem lighter," he commented. Ellie gave a small sideways smile. "Letting go of the past will do that to you," she said. "But," she hesitated. Matthew tilted his head, encouraging her to go on. "But I'm afraid of what comes next," she admitted, looking out into the darkness beyond the field. Matthew rested his elbow on the armrest of his chair, turning slightly toward her. "Afraid of what?" Ellie frowned, choosing her words carefully. "Of standing still," she said. "Of not knowing what to do with the freedom I fought so hard to have." Matthew stayed silent for a moment, thinking it over. "Sometimes," he finally said, "that's exactly what we need to learn. To stand still, to breathe, to figure out who we are without all the chaos." Ellie looked at him, and for a moment, the weight of his words hit her deep inside. "You make it sound so simple," she murmured. Matthew gave a small, sad smile. "It's not. It's damn hard, but you don't have to get it all right at once." Ellie dropped her gaze to the cup in her hands, as if finding courage in its warmth. "Part of me still feels like it's wrong to want to stay," she confessed, "like I'm letting down everyone who believed in me." Matthew leaned forward, catching her attention. "And who's believing in you now?" he asked, his voice steady. She blinked, confused. "I am," he said, holding her gaze. "Caleb is. This whole little town will, if you give it a chance." Ellie bit her lip, emotions swirling inside her like leaves in a storm. "You think I could be happy here?" she asked, her voice trembling. Matthew didn't hesitate. "I think you already are." Those 6 simple words hit her like a blow to the chest. Ellie let out a shaky laugh, feeling tears threaten to fall, but not from sadness. This time, it was relief. It was acceptance. It was love, beginning to bloom even through old scars. She leaned toward him, as if she no longer had the strength to resist what had already been written. And Matthew welcomed her, his arms firm around her. They stayed like that for a long time, rocking gently with the chair, letting the night wrap them in silent promises. Ellie didn't know what the future would bring. But for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like she needed to have all the answers. She just needed to believe. And right now, believing felt easy, because Matthew was there. And as long as he was, she knew she could face anything. The following days passed almost like a dream. Ellie threw herself even more into Matthew and Caleb's routine, helping fix the old barn, chasing the stubborn chickens that kept escaping, planting new flowers in the small front garden. With every simple gesture, every shared laugh, Ellie felt her roots sinking deeper. And for the first time, she wasn't fighting it. She wanted to belong. She wanted to stay. On Saturday morning, as Ellie and Matthew were making breakfast in the kitchen, Caleb came barreling down the stairs, holding a crumpled piece of paper. "There's a fair in town today," he announced, bubbling with excitement. "There's going to be cake, sack races, a pie contest." Matthew smiled, taking the flyer from his son's hands. "It's the fall fair," he explained to Ellie. "Everyone in town shows up." Ellie laughed, already picturing the scene. "Pie contest?" she teased. "That's serious business?" "It's sacred," Matthew said, feigning a grave expression. Caleb was bouncing with excitement next to them. "You're coming, right, Ellie? Please." Ellie didn't even have to think. "Of course I'm coming," she said, her heart warming at Caleb's bright smile. While getting ready, Ellie paused in front of the mirror in the bedroom. She wore a simple, lightweight dress and the worn-out boots Matthew had lent her. She barely recognized herself, and for the first time, she liked what she saw. The fair was everything Caleb had promised. Colorful stalls, the smell of popcorn and caramel apples in the air, kids running everywhere. Matthew and Ellie walked side by side, Caleb always a few steps ahead, as if he had endless energy. Ellie bought 2 cupcakes from an elderly lady with white hair, and then laughed as she watched Matthew lose to Caleb in a sack race. They were in the middle of the square when Ellie heard it, her name, called out loudly. She froze, turned slowly, the smile dying on her lips. Victoria Holt stood a few yards away, the tablet gleaming under the sun. But she wasn't alone. Next to her were two men in suits, lawyers by the look of them, and a town sheriff, whom Ellie recognized by sight. Victoria approached, that cold smile plastered across her face. "Miss Dawson," she said, loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear, "you are hereby formally notified. A lawsuit has been filed against you for breach of fiduciary duty." Matthew immediately stepped forward, instinctively placing himself between Ellie and the woman. "What does that mean?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Victoria lifted her chin, triumphant. "It means if she doesn't appear at a hearing in Atlanta within 7 days, she could lose all her legal rights and face a lawsuit." The sheriff approached, looking awkward. "Sorry, Ellie, just doing my job." He extended the envelope to her, the subpoena. For a moment, the world seemed to spin. The colors of the fair, the laughter, the smell of caramel apples, all of it faded into the background. Ellie took the envelope with trembling fingers. Victoria smiled, satisfied. "See you in court," she said, turning and disappearing into the crowd. Matthew immediately turned to Ellie. "You're not alone," he said, his voice firm like a promise. Caleb looked at her with wide eyes, not fully understanding what was happening, but sensing the heaviness of the moment. Ellie clutched the envelope to her chest, trying to hold back the panic rising inside her. She had thought the fight was over. But now she saw that to truly claim her freedom, she would have to face her past head-on. This time, she couldn't run. This time, she had something, and someone, worth fighting for. Ellie Dawson had never been the kind to give up without a fight. The ride back home was silent. Caleb slept in the back seat, exhausted from the fair, and blissfully unaware of the tension that hung between Matthew and Ellie. Matthew drove with his jaw clenched, eyes fixed on the dusty road. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel, saying everything he hadn't spoken aloud. Anger, worry, and a fierce desire to protect Ellie from all of it. Ellie, on the other hand, stared out the window, the envelope resting on her lap like a sentence. She felt fear clawing at her chest. But now, something was different. Before, fear would have made her run. Now, it stirred a new kind of strength inside her. When they reached the house, Matthew killed the engine and turned to her. "You don't have to do this alone," he said, his voice low but full of determination. Ellie exhaled slowly, letting his words seep into the deepest cracks of her being. "I know," she said. She stepped out of the truck, smoothing down the hem of her dress and clutching the envelope to her chest. Above them, the sky was scattered with stars, indifferent to the human battles unfolding below. Inside the house, after Caleb was tucked into bed, Ellie sat at the kitchen table, opening the envelope with steady hands. Matthew sat across from her, watching silently. She read every line carefully. She understood exactly what they were trying to do: intimidate her, force her back into the role they expected her to play. But she wasn't that woman anymore. When she finished reading, Ellie looked up at Matthew. "I'm going to Atlanta," she said, her voice firm. Matthew frowned. "Ellie." She raised a hand to stop him. "Not to surrender," she said. "To fight." Matthew studied her for a long moment. Then a slow, proud smile spread across his face. "Then we're going to Atlanta," he said. Ellie blinked, surprised. "You don't have to—" "I do," he interrupted, his voice thick with emotion. "You're part of our family now." Ellie felt her throat tighten. Family. The word echoed inside her like a promise, like home. The next morning, Ellie called Alan Brooks, her trusted ally. She explained what had happened, and without hesitation, he promised he would be in Atlanta to support her in court. "You're not alone in this, Ellie," he said over the phone. Later, Matthew helped her pack a small bag, even though she was only going for a hearing. "No matter what happens there," he said, as he helped her zip the bag closed, "what matters is who you are now, not who they want you to be." Ellie nodded, her heart heavy, but full of something new: courage. Before they left, Caleb ran up to her, hugging her legs tightly. "It's gonna be okay, Ellie," he said, smiling with the unshakable confidence only kids have. Ellie knelt down and kissed the top of his head. "It will, champ." Matthew placed a hand on her back, guiding her outside. In the truck, as the house disappeared behind them and the road unspooled ahead, Ellie looked at Matthew. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. He just squeezed her hand over the seat, needing no words. They were in this together, and together, nothing could break them. Atlanta was waiting. The past was challenging them. But Ellie knew, with unshakable certainty, that she had already won the most important battle. She had found herself, and no one, absolutely no one, could ever take that away from her. Atlanta felt like a different world. Glass skyscrapers reflected the morning sun as cars and people rushed through the streets. Everything was fast, impersonal, cold, exactly what Ellie had left behind. Matthew walked beside her, his eyes sharp, his presence steady, as if he could shield her from the whole city just by standing close. At the courthouse steps, Alan Brooks was waiting for them, dressed in a sharp dark suit and wearing an encouraging smile. "Ellie," he greeted, shaking her hand firmly. "Are you ready?" Ellie took a deep breath. "Yes." They entered together. The courtroom was wide and cold, with rows of benches and dark wooden walls. At the far end, Victoria Holt and her lawyers were already waiting, wearing expressions of absolute confidence. As Ellie crossed the room, she felt all eyes turn to her. In the past, it would have made her palms sweat, her heart race. But now, she walked with her head held high, feeling Matthew right behind her. A silent, solid force. The judge, a graying man with a sharp gaze, asked the parties to introduce themselves. Victoria was the first to speak, laying out her case with icy precision. Allegations of abandonment of duty, fiduciary irresponsibility, financial damages. It was all rehearsed, impersonal. When it was Ellie's turn, she stood. Alan made a move to speak for her, but Ellie placed a hand on his arm and shook her head. She wanted to say it herself. The judge watched her as she stepped to the center of the room. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady. "I built Dawson Enterprises with the dream of creating something that was more than just numbers. I believed in innovation, in taking care of people. But the company changed. Or maybe I did." She paused, letting her words hang in the silent room. "I stayed in charge long after I lost my passion, out of fear of letting people down, of failing. But I became trapped in a life that wasn't mine anymore." Victoria crossed her arms, impatient, but Ellie ignored her. "I left the company because I needed to save the only thing left worth saving. Myself." She turned to the judge. "My resignation was legal and legitimate. There was no abandonment, only the choice to truly live instead of surviving in a place where I no longer belonged." Matthew watched, his chest tight with pride. The Ellie standing before him wasn't a runaway. She was a warrior. The judge listened quietly, jotting down notes. After a tense moment, he cleared his throat and spoke. "Based on the documentation presented and the arguments made, I find no grounds for the accusations. The court acknowledges the validity of Miss Dawson's resignation. This case is dismissed." The sound of the gavel striking echoed like thunder in Ellie's mind. She had won. Victoria stood up abruptly, gathering her papers angrily, but Ellie didn't spare her another glance. She turned to Matthew. He was already smiling, that small, steady smile that said everything without needing words. Ellie crossed the room, ignoring the curious stares and murmurs. When she reached Matthew, he opened his arms, and without hesitation, she threw herself into them, feeling his strong arms wrap around her. "You did it," he whispered into her hair. "No, we did it," she corrected, smiling with tears in her eyes. Alan shook her hand, congratulating her, but Ellie barely heard him. All that mattered was that the past was finally behind her. And the future was starting now, in Matthew's arms, with a life she would choose freely, every single day. The drive back home was different. This time, Ellie wasn't carrying the weight of the world on her back. She carried freedom. She rested her head against the truck window, watching the landscape change from the concrete jungle to the open fields, already touched by the golden colors of fall. Matthew drove peacefully, one hand on the wheel, the other occasionally brushing against hers on the seat, as if he needed to make sure she was still there. And Ellie needed it too. When they arrived, Caleb ran out of the house, his eyes bright. "Did you win?" he shouted, barely able to contain his excitement. Ellie knelt down, opening her arms. "We won. The boy hugged her tightly, and Ellie closed her eyes for a moment, soaking it all in. The smell of hay in the air, the warmth of Caleb's hug, the solid presence of Matthew standing behind her. She was home. Truly. In the days that followed, life settled into a new rhythm. Ellie woke up early, had breakfast with Matthew and Caleb, helped with the planting, took care of the animals. Every small task seemed to carry a meaning she had never found in million-dollar meetings and contracts. One quiet afternoon, while she and Matthew were painting the fence, Ellie paused to take in the view. The golden fields stretched as far as the eye could see, and the sky was such a pure blue it almost hurt to look at. Matthew walked up to her, splattered with white paint, smiling that easy, quiet smile that made her heart stumble. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, tapping her shoulder with his paintbrush and leaving a white smudge. Ellie let out a soft laugh, dodging away. "I was thinking. I didn't know happiness could be so simple." Matthew dropped the brush into the grass and took her hand. "It's not simple, Ellie," he said, his gaze serious. "It's brave. You're brave." She bit her lip, moved. "I couldn't have done it without you." Matthew tilted his head, his blue eyes shining under the sun. "You already had it all here," he said, touching her chest. "You just needed to remember." Before she could reply, he pulled her closer and kissed her. It wasn't a rushed or hungry kiss. It was a calm, tender kiss, full of silent promises, the kind of kiss that said, "I see you, I choose you, I'm staying with you." When they pulled apart, Ellie rested her forehead against his, smiling. "I choose to stay," she whispered. Matthew squeezed her hand tighter. "So do I." That night, under a starry sky and a full moon, Ellie, Matthew, and Caleb sat on the porch, wrapped in blankets, sipping hot chocolate. Caleb was the first to fall asleep, his head drooping onto Ellie's lap. Matthew stretched his arm out behind her, gently pulling her closer. "You found your home," he said softly. Ellie looked around, at the simple house, at the quiet fields, at the sleeping boy, and at the man who looked at her like she was everything he'd ever needed. And she knew he was right. Here, among the scent of earth and hope, between steady hands and open hearts, she had found what she had always been searching for. Not success, not power, but love. Real love. Love that would choose her every single day, and that she would choose right back. Ellie smiled, closing her eyes and letting peace wash over her completely. For the first time, she didn't need to run. She was exactly where she was meant to be, home, forever.